Welcome to Remember Me by Intervivos, the show about living life to its fullest, leaving a legacy, and deciding how you will be remembered. And now, your humble team of expert planners taking the legal world by storm.
Hi, welcome to Remember Me, the show where we talk about leaving a legacy, planning how you'll be remembered, and making a difference. I'm Glenn Wagstaff. I'm here in studio with Mike Black. And today we're talking about, last couple weeks we've been talking about parents. And today we're talking about step-parents. And a lot of times, you look at kind of the step-parent blended family situation, and there's sometimes there's perceived inequalities and sometimes there's real inequalities, right? But I think it's a delicate situation where there's always a worry that, well, what if mom loves her kids more than dad's kids from a previous marriage, right? And so that's what we want to kind of get into a little bit today, and kind of talk a little bit about those scenarios. So, Mike, you were, we've talked a little bit about this.
Right.
You have some experience with blended families.
Yeah, I actually come from a blended family. My mom and dad got married when I was 10. And, you never know. They just celebrated their 50th anniversary last year. So they've had a long term. But my mom, if you look at it, she would have been the stepmother in this situation because my dad had 5 kids, my mom had 3. And then together they had 3 together, 3 more. So we had a big
Was
family.
it yours, mine, and ours?
Yours, mine, and ours. So it was a really mixed up, blended kind of situation. But, when I was growing up, I was 10 when my parents got married, and I remember thinking, this is great. I now have sisters where I never had sisters before. I had 2 little brothers, and now I've got brothers too. I had an older brother where I was the oldest before, and now, it's an interesting dynamic. And, Dad looked at that as well, and I remember him all the time. He never treated us any differently, and he tried to make it because, my older brother, his name was Mike too. It was Richard Michael, and he went by Mike. So he was Big Mike, I was Little Mike. So he actually told me one time when we were on a father-son outing, he said, start calling him Dad. I was kind of hesitant, but then I started doing it. It just felt natural. And he just took over the role as being my dad. So it didn't seem all that different because, our dynamic seemed just normal. We thought it was just normal for everybody.
Yeah. Yeah, well, statistically, I think nowadays the non-nuclear family is the more common scenario. And whether it's a situation with a single parent or whether it's a blended family or second marriage or all kinds of different variations of that. But it's a very common scenario nowadays to have differences in the family structure.
Oh, absolutely. The non-normal is now the norm.
So, an interesting thing we kind of wanted, the topic for today that we kind of want to get into is the Cinderella story. And the other Cinderella story,
yeah. not the rags to riches kind of one.
Right. Yeah. So I'm accused all the time of looking for estate planning in the places where you shouldn't be thinking about it. But when I watch movies, that's what pops out to me. So when I look at Cinderella, I'm like, oh, you know what? That's all about estate planning.
Well, I saw a movie today. It was Iron Man, and I saw estate planning in there too. So
yeah. So when we there's so many variations now on the Cinderella story, but one of the favorite ones is a movie called Ever After.
Yes,
and
very good movie.
You can see in that one where the dad was just remarried. Cinderella's excited about her new family and her stepmother and her stepsisters, right? And then the dad dies of a stroke, and the intention was he wanted to leave everything to his daughter, And that's where, the stepmom feels like she was snubbed. He loved Cinderella more than her, and so that's why she takes it out on her, right?
Right.
And but the idea being that Cinderella would have been the heir to this large estate, and she would have been in those times she would have been wealthy. She would have been the equivalent of a noble, but for the fact that surviving spouse receives everything. And so
and then she has favorite children,
right?
She has 2 children, and she favors one of them, and the other one kind of gets snubbed too, if you remember that part of it.
And so Cinderella in essence becomes a servant girl, as part of the household, but just eating the crumbs and taking the scraps and everything else, and in the original folk tale, the Cinder Girl, right?
Right.
She slept next to the fireplace, right? And so but it's interesting because I think in our culture it's such a a beloved story that we've heard for generations and we've passed along, right? But I think that kind of fear of the new step parent that steps into the family kind of is part of that that story that's kind of been passed on,
yes.
right?
And it's a natural fear, because sometimes there is this separation and there's this disparity between the families.
Well, and part of it is because there's in a blended family there's a mixing of possibly of traditions, of cultures, of established habits, and really it's the blending of 2 households, right? And you don't see that as much in a nuclear family, but it's interesting because we were looking at articles kind of exploring the real stories of evil step-parents, right? And, there's some of these horrible stories of step-parents that do horrible things.
Oh, I was reading a bunch of them. There's some just nasty step-parents. They treat their kids, they actually put them in like dungeons and really bad.
Yeah, not just financial abuse, but real abuse, right?
Real abuse, yes, that was
happen.
just horrendous.
And sometimes without explanation, really, other than the fact that, well, they're not my kid, and
yeah, well, and they're acting up, so to speak, so they punish them. I read one where some mother made their daughter, it wasn't her daughter, it was the father's daughter, drink a gallon of water or more, and that actually drowned her. So it's scary out there. What happens out?
So there are some of those scenarios that are just scary scenarios that are that's a reality that can happen. But a lot of times, I think that the worry is, what if, what if stepmom or stepdad, loves their kids more, or does something to try to, take mom's inheritance or
dad's inheritance,
what dad left for us. So a story that that we actually dealt with was the first husband had passed away. Mom was left with everything that he had built up over his lifetime, and there were several kids that were part of that union, and then when mom gets remarried, they're happy for her and they're excited about the the new husband, but there was never any change to the estate plan that was in place before. And so then mom dies, and this was in the state of California, and when she actually passed away in the state of Utah, but she dies without having changed her estate plan. And so under, the probate code, there's something called an omitted spouse.
Right.
And basically an omitted spouse is a spouse that, because normally you can't just disinherit your spouse.
Right.
Without a good reason. And so a spouse that wasn't included in the current estate plan, because they were omitted, right? And so the new husband wasn't part of that estate plan, but But even though everything in the estate plan would have left everything to the children, and that was the intention because it was all from the previous marriage that was built up over time, and he was already provided for with his own assets, because he was the current spouse and he was an omitted spouse, he got what's called his elective share. And under the laws of the state of Utah, that was 100% of everything.
Oh.
And so the kids were expecting to get the inheritance.
And he got it.
And he got it all. And with no legal obligations to share, and actually he didn't, right? So that can happen. Sometimes it does happen.
Yeah. And
under the laws of the state of California, it might have been different. But, yeah, crazy scenario. So when we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about this. But estate planning is what we're kind of focusing on today. If you want to get a hold of us, 801-477-1570. That's 801-477-1570, and we'll come back after the break. Welcome back to Remember Me, the show where we talk about leaving a legacy, deciding how you'll be remembered, and making a difference. We're talking about step families, and today, before we get into a little bit more of the discussion, anything we talk about is of course, we talk about legal topics, we talk about financial topics. It's not advice specifically for your situation. You need to consult with a professional to get those specific questions answered. And actually, next week we'll have a guest on the show from Peace Legal to talk a little bit about from the family law perspective. Some of the issues that comes up, post-divorce with your estate planning and with blended families, and some of the concerns of how to plan around the issues that we're talking about today, and also from the estate planning perspective, from Intervivos and what we do with the estate planning side of it. So we'll have Haley on the show next week to talk about that.
Excellent.
But we're talking about the kind of the risk of unequal treatment in your estate when there's a second marriage. And sometimes it's just a worry, and sometimes it's something that can turn into a reality. And we were sharing the story of the unintended consequences of not updating your plan when you get remarried in a second marriage situation. But it was an interesting statistic in one of the articles that we were reading and preparing for today, which talked about the actual statistics of second marriage situations, and whether the children of the first marriage actually got less in the estate than they would have normally in a second marriage situation. And the statistics say, yes, they do. Actually, that amount has been steadily increasing over the last 15 years.
Right.
That the second spouse or
their surviving spouse,
their family, the natural children from the first marriage get less of the estate than they used to. What do you think that comes from?
That's a really good question, but it's probably it might be that they are favored, and because the surviving spouse does have rights, and there's a favoritism there. I think they favor their children, and they don't think there's anything wrong with that.
Sometimes I think it's obvious favoritism, that they know what they're doing, and sometimes it's just latent, that you don't think that there's an issue, but it just happens to turn out that way. And sometimes, and this is in general, but when people get older and they have dementia, or they're kind of in their final stages where they start losing their memory a little bit, then they're prone to what we call undue influence in the industry, right? But somebody whispering in their ear and telling them to change things or leave more to them, or those sort of things. And unfortunately, what ends up happening is the person who has their ear, that can kind of whisper those things is generally their natural child that has the closest relationship, right? So in the yours,
Right.
mine, and ours situation, often it might be, the child of, mom who was, with her the longest and maybe has a close relationship, as opposed to, the joint children who are still young, or the children of dad from the previous marriage, right?
So the child is actually spending more time with them in their later years, has more time to be with them. Maybe the other children are out of state, don't have the ability to be there all the time. That could cause a problem.
Sometimes it's the excuse is that they're the caregiver, right? And,
Right.
And well, I've been the one taking care of you, and so I deserve to get more.
And I have heard that before.
And sometimes there's a good reason for it. And, one of the things I always tell my clients is I say, look, nobody's entitled to anything except what you decide to leave them, right? Fair is whatever you think is fair. It's not what the kids think is fair. But at the same time, what can happen is, dad has a plan for what he wants to have happen with his estate, and mom might have a different plan. And if that's not put in writing and set in stone, then when one of them's gone, the survivor could change the plan, right? And it might not be what was intended. In fact, we had a client that we reviewed a plan that was done by a previous attorney who had set up the plan to allow for that flexibility of the plan to change, even though they had decided together what was supposed to happen. And then, of course, when the husband died, then they came in with the family and with the intention of changing the plan because they didn't like what dad wanted, right? And so that's the risk.
Now, there are times also that I understand that the wife has her own separate plan, and father, the dad has his own plan, and then they could be mutually exclusive or mutually inclusive. Is that right?
Yeah. So, one of the safest things to do in the case of a new marriage is to make sure that you're addressing how are things going to be handled in terms of division. Are we going to actually combine finances, or are we going to keep them separate? And if we're going to keep them separate, then come up with an agreement from the beginning, right? Whether it's a prenuptial agreement or a postnuptial agreement to kind of address that separation of assets. And then another way to do it is in your actual estate plan is to, come up with a plan that becomes irrevocable when something happens to one of you, right? So if you're incapacitated or if you pass away, then the plan that you decided together becomes unchangeable, right? And because most of the time it's really it's just a lack of communication.
Usually, yes. And, I was reading this about, Tony Curtis. He married a gal that was 42 years younger than him. It was like marrying her grandpa almost, And, that was a wealthy family. He's Hollywood nobility, but his kids were kind of left out of it because she went in and changed it.
Well, and even let's say that she didn't change it. Let's say that he just left it for her. This could be a scenario, right?
Right.
But where she's that much younger than him, if he leaves it for her lifetime to benefit from, all the kids might be dead by the time she's gone, right?
That's true. That's absolutely true.
And so, it'll skip their generation by default because she was still alive during all that time.
That's an interesting point.
So, yeah, I mean, those are all considerations. Obviously, we had a client that she was marrying really because she was lonely and wanted companionship, and at that point, she was in her, I want to say 80s, but the person that she was marrying her was really trying to convince her to leave him everything. And that was kind of the inducement for the marriage. And, in her situation, she understood that and she wanted that. And obviously the kids were concerned about it.
Yeah, I would hope
but she was more than happy to give up her retirement in return for, getting
some
married.
Companionship.
And, sometimes that happens.
Oh, yeah, I can understand that because loneliness is really, really hard sometimes.
So sometimes as a child in that situation, we say, well, well, that's not fair. That's not what was supposed to happen. And to the extent that, the deceased parent had intentions that they made clear to everybody, then maybe that's right. But if it's still mom's money, then it's still mom's money, right? Or if it's still dad's money, then it's still dad's money, right?
Well, the kids should be able to live on their own, right? They should be able to take care of themselves. Well, if they're adult children. So mom has every right to do what she wants to do. She's an adult herself.
Yeah. Well, so next week we're going to be exploring strategies on how to address some of these things. But, as we kind of dig into just, the step family situation, right? And we think of, how do we keep the relationship strong between stepmom or stepdad and the children, and whatever ages they happen to be? Is that something that ever, came up as an issue or as a discussion topic in your family? Like, I mean...
it never really did. We, sometimes we had sibling rivalries, even though we weren't blood relatives, but it was an interesting dynamic, and it never really came up. I did have my oldest brother, yell at me one time and told me he hated me and to leave me alone, but, I was probably an annoying little brother, so something would happen. But, so we always came together. So
it's one of those things that, they always say you never talk about, finances and politics and, religion and those sort of things, right? But in a family, those are things that need to be talked about. And especially, the estate is something that everybody should get on the same page about. So
absolutely.
So thanks for joining us today. This is Intervivos sponsoring Remember Me. And next week we're going to have a guest from Peace Legal to talk about a little bit more about blended families and second marriages and post-divorce scenarios. So thanks for joining us this week, and we'll talk to you next week.